Picture this, May 22, 1992. 50 million Americans are glued to their televisions, saying goodbye to the man who tucked them into bed every night for 3 decades. Johnny Carson takes his final bow on The Tonight Show, waves to the audience one last time, and then something extraordinary happens. He vanishes. Not gradually, not with the occasional comeback special or nostalgic interview. He simply disappears from public life as completely as if he'd never existed. The king of late night, the man whose face was more familiar to Americans than their own neighbors, becomes a ghost. For the next 13 years until his death, Johnny Carson would see fewer than 20 people per year outside his immediate household. No interviews, no appearances, no exceptions. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. This wasn't the tragic decline of a broken celebrity. This was exactly what Johnny had been planning all along. The question isn't why he disappeared. The question is why he ever appeared in the first place. From the moment those studio lights went dark for the last time, Johnny retreated to his Malibu fortress and locked the door on the outside world. But to understand why, we need to understand something that millions of viewers never suspected during those 30 years of seemingly effortless charm and wit. The Johnny Carson they loved never actually existed. Peter Lazzali, his longtime producer, was one of the few who saw behind the mask. He watched in fascination and growing concern as Johnny would transform the instant the camera stopped rolling. One moment, he'd be the vibrant, quick-witted host America adored. The next moment, mid-sentence, he'd deflate like someone had cut his strings. The charm would drain from his face. His voice would go monotone. And all he could think about was getting home to his couch, away from people, away from the performance. To Johnny, hosting The Tonight Show wasn't a dream job or a calling. It was exactly what he called it, a job. A role he played with consummate skill, then discarded the moment he could. The extent of Johnny's isolation was almost pathological. He insisted NBC build him a private exit, so he could slip out of the studio without encountering fans or even coworkers. Small talk with crew members, he'd rather do crossword puzzles alone in his dressing room. Chatting with colleagues between tapings? Not a chance. While other hosts worked the room and networked relentlessly, Johnny worked to avoid every human interaction possible. Industry events became his personal nightmare. His competitor Merv Griffin would attend 45 or more Hollywood parties and galas each year, schmoozing and maintaining his presence in the scene. Johnny forced himself to attend maybe 12, and that was in a good year. He'd show up, fulfill his obligation, and escape as quickly as politeness allowed. His excuse became legendary in Hollywood circles: parties are for extroverts. I'd rather go home and talk to my dog. Not his wife, his dog. This wasn't a joke. This was Johnny's actual preference, and it might explain why he went through 4 marriages, each one ending when the woman finally realized she'd married a man who was fundamentally unavailable. His daily routine after retirement read like a manual for hermit living. Mornings were for playing tennis alone, hitting balls against a wall rather than finding a partner. Afternoons meant reading astronomy magazines in complete solitude, losing himself in the vast emptiness of space, perhaps finding it more comforting than the company of other humans. He'd have brief, controlled phone calls with Jay Leno to swap jokes, but these were professional exchanges, transactions rather than conversation. When director Howard Smith visited, Johnny would chat for a few polite minutes before asking his guest to please be quiet so they could watch the stars together in silence. Smith later described Johnny as content, but was it contentment? Something else entirely. Something darker that had been growing inside Johnny since childhood. Every evening Johnny ate dinner at home, not because invitations didn't come, they flooded in constantly, but because he refused them all. His 4th wife, Alexis Mass, described their quiet dinners with no guests unless family absolutely demanded it. She claimed Johnny thrived in the silence, but the word thriving seems generous for a man who would rather rit alone or stare at the ocean than engage with his own wife. Yet, here's the paradox that made Johnny Carson so difficult to understand. This same man who couldn't give his wife basic attention wrote checks for millions of dollars to strangers in need. He was privately, quietly charitable, helping people he'd never meet while neglecting those closest to him. How does that contradiction exist in one person? The answer lies in Norfolk, Nebraska, where a shy boy named John hid behind his family's upright piano whenever guests came to visit. While other children played baseball and chased each other through cornfields, Johnny stayed inside reading comics and practicing card tricks from a mail-order magic kit. At 14, he experienced stomach-knotting dread before any social interaction. He'd crouch in shadows, shuffling playing cards, doing anything to avoid being noticed because being noticed meant risking imperfection. And imperfection meant facing his mother's wrath. Ruth Carson didn't raise children. She commanded them like a captain running a warship. Affection was currency in her household, and she was viciously stingy with it. She demanded perfection but made it clear she believed Johnny was incapable of achieving it. She thought he was dirty and worthless, and she wasn't shy about letting him know. Even after he became the most famous television host in America, reports suggest she ridiculed him. When Ruth died in October 1985, Johnny's response to friends was chilling. "The wicked witch is dead." He refused to attend her funeral, but then he went to her home and made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hidden away in her house was a large box filled with clippings from his entire career. Every article, every review, every mention of his success carefully preserved. The woman who never showed him affection had been his biggest secret fan all along. Johnny took that box and kept it in his bedroom closet until the day he died. Did he regret not going to her funeral? Did it change anything? Living in that toxic environment warped Johnny's entire perception of human interaction. He learned that people were dangerous, that engagement meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant pain. But he also discovered something else. Audiences loved him. When he performed magic tricks as the great Carsoni at age 14, making $3 per show, he felt a warmth from strangers that he never received at home. This became his blueprint for life. Get love from crowds. Maintain distance from individuals. It's the reason a shy, introverted person would choose to become a late-night television host. The Tonight Show format was perfect for Johnny because it created the illusion of intimacy without requiring actual vulnerability. Everything was scripted, controlled, predictable. He could perform connection without risking real connection. It was therapy and torture combined, and as his fame grew, the balance shifted. Fame made his off-camera privacy impossible, and that privacy was the only thing he truly wanted. But there was another reason Johnny disappeared from public life, one he desperately tried to hide, even as it slowly killed him. In September 2002, 2 years before his death, Johnny's representatives insisted he was in perfect health. Johnny himself told CBS News the tabloids were lying about his condition. But Johnny wasn't fine, and he'd brought his illness entirely on himself through an addiction he was too ashamed to admit. The NBC archives tell a shocking story. Johnny Carson smoked 40 to 60 cigarettes every single day, 3 full packs during high-stress tapings. Between monologues and commercial breaks, while millions watched him make it look cool, his lungs were being destroyed in real time. The chesty coughs wouldn't go away. Doctors warned him repeatedly, but Johnny couldn't stop. He was addicted and privately told loved ones that cigarettes were killing him, yet he continued. He admitted in the late 70s that he should have gotten help, but shame kept him smoking, and guilt made every cigarette worse. By 1991, the danger could no longer be ignored. Doctors diagnosed him with emphysema, and suddenly his retirement made perfect sense. Johnny wasn't leaving because he wanted to. He was escaping before his body failed on national television. He chose retirement with dignity over public humiliation by suffocation. But retirement didn't stop the disease. By 1993, walking 100 yards would leave him gasping for breath, so severely he'd have to stop and recover. His lung capacity dropped to 35% by 2004. Most people at that level require constant supplemental oxygen just to sit upright. Reports claim Johnny refused oxygen therapy and possibly kept smoking. The incident in 1995 should have terrified him into stopping. But addiction and pride, that toxic inheritance from his mother, wouldn't let him admit weakness. Between 1999 and 2004, he was hospitalized repeatedly for heart attacks and pneumonia. By 2004, he required 24-hour oxygen therapy, meaning constant tubes in his nose, constant reminders of his mortality, constant limitations on every movement and moment. Johnny, who'd spent years insisting he was fine, finally admitted he was living on borrowed time. On January 23, 2005, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, that time ran out. Respiratory failure from emphysema. The smoking he'd loved to hate finally killed him. But perhaps Johnny had stopped wanting to live long before the disease took him. Perhaps that's why he refused the oxygen that might have bought him more time. Because by 2005, Johnny had suffered losses that made living feel more like punishment than privilege. His marriage to college sweetheart Joan Walcott had produced 3 sons, Christopher, Rick, and Corey. Then fame arrived and brought destruction with it. After 14 years, the marriage collapsed because Johnny admitted he'd cheated and become obsessed with work. But worse than losing his wife was losing his sons. The divorce created a chasm between Johnny and his boys that he never bridged, never even tried to bridge, because he immediately married Joanne Copeland and repeated all the same mistakes. That marriage lasted 9 years before Joanne accused him of emotional neglect and workaholism. Their divorce cost him $500,000, but the emotional toll was incalculable. His third marriage to Joanna Holland in 1972 lasted 13 turbulent years that nearly bankrupted him. She was a socialite whose high society lifestyle clashed violently with Johnny's desperate need for isolation. Their divorce battle over a $20 million settlement left Johnny financially and emotionally devastated. By 1987, when he married his fourth wife Alexis, 26 years his junior, Johnny had learned enough to seek someone fiercely private who wouldn't drag him into the social circus. But he still hadn't learned how to actually connect, choosing to read or play tennis alone rather than talk to her. Then came 1991, and an incident that drove Johnny so deep into himself he never fully emerged. On June 21st, Rick Carson's car went off a cliff on a narrow California road. The death shattered Johnny, who carried crushing guilt over never being close to his sons. He mourned for weeks and never truly recovered. In 1995, the losses continued when Christopher died at 45 from lung cancer. He'd been a heavy smoker just like his father. How do you process the knowledge that your child died from a habit they learned by watching you? How do you wake up every day carrying that weight? Johnny and his surviving son Corey were so estranged they rarely spoke. A lifetime of fame had brought him everything except the one thing he desperately needed, genuine human connection. What's the point of all this? Johnny would ask those close to him in his final years, a man who'd outlived 2 of his 3 children. Really, what was the point? When Johnny Carson died, there was no public memorial service, just as he'd wanted, just as he'd planned since the moment he walked off that stage in 1992. The man who'd been invited into 50 million homes every night for 30 years died in essential solitude, surrounded by fewer than 20 people who actually knew him. America mourned the loss of their beloved host, but they were mourning someone who'd never truly existed outside the television screen. The real Johnny Carson spent his entire life hiding, first behind a piano as a frightened child, then behind a desk as America's most famous performer, and finally behind the walls of a Malibu home, where he could at last stop pretending. He'd been running from his mother's cruelty, from his own inability to connect, from the addiction that was killing him, and ultimately from a world that loved a version of him he could never actually be. In the end, Johnny Carson got exactly what he'd always wanted, to be left completely alone. The tragedy is that being alone was the only thing that never brought him peace.